What pops in your head when you hear the term serial killer? Typically, our consciousness automatically draws a cliché: a maniac hiding in a basement or lying in wait near a forest line. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Chikatilo, Dennis Rader. We're used to thinking that this kind of evil always lurks in the shadows, on the fringes of society. But criminal psychology knows other examples too. Today, I invite you to ask yourselves, what happens when a highly organized psychopath with a God complex, a sadist who revels in the agony of others, and who doesn't hide in a basement? What if he puts on a business suit, holds a professor's title of theologian, and integrates into the government apparatus? What if an entire country becomes his crime scene, and instead of a murder weapon, he uses pseudo-expert opinions, laws, and mass media? I came across several materials. A key one is a book, The Serial Killer Against God, by James Ressler. According to the info recounted in the book, its author is a former American FBI agent and profiler who worked in behavioral analysis and violent crime profiling. Another major source I'll be referring back to is Viktor Fridman's book, The Kremlin Maniac. This book is believed to have served as one of the source materials for James Ressler's subsequent analytical investigation. In addition, I'll be using analytical materials from independent journalists of the Act Files portal, which I've already referenced in my previous video investigations. I suggest we carefully examine this material through the lens of a forensic science and behavioral analysis. Our focus will be on the phenomenon of the transnational anti-cult initiatives which, according to available materials and their comparative interpretation, operate through entities publicly declaring noble goals, like protection of society and fighting dangerous cults. Yet, a closer look at their activities, and especially the consequences of those, raises grounds for asking a much more serious question. Can this kind of seemingly normative and socially acceptable rhetoric conceal a different, potentially more dangerous behavioral mechanism? My goal is to demonstrate that what has long been perceived as a destructive anti-cult ideology can, from a certain analytical perspective, be interpreted as a manifestation of a deeper and more socially significant behavioral pattern, a model that forensic and behavioral sciences typically use to describe extreme forms of violent behavior. Only here, it has been transformed and adapted to fit the institutional, media, and pseudo-expert environment. I want to emphasize that all conclusions, observations, and assessments that will follow reflect the analytical interpretations of the authors of the aforementioned materials. They are based on publicly available sources and do not constitute legal opinions, court rulings, or determinations of guilt. This is not a guilty verdict, but an analytical reconstruction and an attempt to draw a holistic behavioral profile based on an open source data. References to specific individuals, organizations, and institutions are solely based on public records and strictly for the purpose of academic, analytical, and human rights discussion. Each viewer should draw their own final conclusions by comparing the presented facts, interpretations, and analytical logic. This video has been prepared to systematically analyze publicly available information about Alexander Leonidovich Dvorkin, born on August 20th, 1955 in Moscow, USSR. According to multiple independent sources, including reports by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a French NGO, CAPLC, which holds a consultative status with the UN, information materials from the Bitter Winter portal, James Ressler's book, The Serial Killer Against God, and publications from the Act Files portal, Dvorkin occupies a core position in a transnational network of organizations and individuals. These sources also point to practices that some experts interpret as systematic stigmatization, the use of legal mechanisms to exert pressure, informational influence, and potential interference in the rights of religious minorities, civic initiatives, and individuals. Before moving on, I'll give a brief background for those who encounter the topic of behavioral analysis of criminals for the first time. Why am I specifically referring to James Ressler's book? And why do I consider it important for investigating activities of the anti-cult network? Because according to the book itself, its author, James Ressler, is a former FBI agent who worked in behavioral science and criminal profiling. The Behavioral Science Unit, BSU, is a pioneering profiling agency. The unit was founded in the 1970s at the FBI Academy in Quantico. Up until then, police searched for criminals primarily based on hard evidence, fingerprints, murder weapons, and motives, such as robbery or jealousy. But when serial killers with unclear motives began to emerge, the old methods no longer worked. That's why BSU agents came up with the unconventional approach. They began to visit prisons and conduct long, detailed interviews with convicted violent offenders. Their goal was to understand how such people think, what their childhoods were like, and what triggers their aggression. Through this, the BSU compiled a tremendous database. They proved that, based on how a crime is committed, it is possible to create a highly accurate psychological profile of the perpetrator, their approximate age, profession, marital status, type of car they drive, and even intelligence level. A modern institutional successor to the BSU is considered to be the BAU, Behavioral Analysis Unit. Today, it's an active specialized unit within the FBI, operating under the National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, which focuses on the practical application of behavioral analysis methods in investigating complex cases. Contrary to popular stereotypes, the BAU's work goes way beyond just serial killers. The unit looks at a wide range of crimes, including kidnappings, bomb threats, blackmail, crimes against children, certain forms of organized violence, and also complex cases requiring reconstruction of motives, victim selection patterns, and behavioral styles. One of the important tools in this kind of analysis is victimology, a detailed study of a victim's personality, lifestyle, vulnerabilities, social circle, and the circumstances where they were chosen by the perpetrator. In the logic of behavioral analysis, the question, why this specific victim, often becomes a key to understanding not just the motive, but also the inner structure of the perpetrator. Analysis of their life story, childhood experiences, and personal texts, like diaries, letters, autobiographies, and memoirs, is another important part of the psychological and behavioral analysis of perpetrators' personality. Behavioral examination at the crime scene is helpful in answering the question, what happened? And how did it happen? But studying a person's life path, recurring biographical themes, and modes of self-presentation allows us to approach a much tougher question. What psychological mechanisms actually underlie such behavior? In professional practice, these kinds of approaches may fall within the realm of retrospective behavioral analysis, psychobiographical profiling, and retrospective psychological reconstruction of personality. First off, I need to explain why childhood and early life experiences matter so much. Behavioral analysis, especially the tradition of American criminology and profiling, proceeds from a premise that severe forms of violent behavior, including serial violence, do not just happen suddenly and outside of a biographical context. That's not a simple linear pattern or a fatal predetermination. Instead, it's about how a personality develops over a long period of time, shaped by a whole mix of factors: individual characteristics, family environment, traumatic experiences, social conditions, and ingrained responses to humiliation, fear, rejection, or helplessness. That's why, when looking at the early stages of a criminal's life, experts aren't searching for one single event that explains everything. They're looking for significant shaping mechanisms, recurring traumatic episodes, deep seated feelings of shame, helplessness, rage, a need for control, disrupt attachments, family dynamics, and early methods of psychological compensation. One of the valuable sources in such analysis can be the subject's personal texts, autobiographies, letters, diary entries, memoirs, or interviews. It's not just about the facts they lay out, it's really about how they tell their own story. Individuals with pronounced antisocial, narcissistic, or psychopathic traits often seek to justify themselves in such texts, portray themselves as victims of circumstances, shift the blame onto others, or, on the contrary, construct an image of an exceptional, almost mythical figure. That's why an expert analyzes not just the sequences of events, but also the structure of the narrative itself, the word choices, emphasis, omissions, emotional tone, methods of self-justification, attitudes towards victims, guilt, humiliation, and power. In other words, it's not just the facts contained in an autobiographical text that matter. It's also the author's personality that is revealed indirectly through language patterns, their system of meanings, and the way they present themselves. Because of this, working with autobiographical material actually overlaps a bit with psycholinguistic and narrative analysis. Another important source that I'll repeatedly mention today is an analytical report by the independent journalists from the Act Files portal, titled Sectology Professor or Serial Killer. Based on its internal structure, its research logic, and how it interprets biographical data, this article can be classified as a psychobiographical analysis. It's especially important to emphasize this because psychobiography isn't just some journalistic text. It's a strictly defined research approach. A psychobiography is a method of psychological research based on systematic application of psychological theories to analyze the life path, personality, motivations, and behavioral decisions of specific individuals. This method is most often used with historical figures, politicians, public activists, writers, artists, or other individuals whose lives left behind a large volume of texts, testimonies, and actions that can be reconstructed. So, it follows that psychobiographical analysis is a practical application of this method to a specific case. Its goal isn't just to recount life facts, but to figure out how early experiences, childhood traumas, internal conflicts, developed psychological defense mechanisms, coping strategies, and a broader sociocultural context may have influenced formation of a person's personality, their thinking style, and decisions they subsequently made in their public, professional, or ideological activities. Hence, this material is interesting not only as a journalistic investigation, but also as an attempt to reconstruct the subject's internal psychological logic through their biography, speech, auto-narrative, and recurring behavioral patterns. Going back to the topic of today's research, it's important to take the next step. If autobiographical texts, interviews, personal memoirs, and psychobiographical reconstructions can indeed serve as material for behavioral analysis, then a logical question arises. What exactly emerges from this array of data in the case of Alexander Dvorkin? We witness a story of a man who, for decades, has been publicly presented as an expert, moralist, fighter against cults and sects, and defender of society from so-called dangerous cults. Take a close look at these photos and videos. He's a man with a professional demeanor, church connections, and a reputation as a public denouncer and bearer of expert knowledge. However, when you compare the materials available today, biographical, autobiographical, documentary, and analytical, it leads to a fundamentally different question. Who is really hiding behind this respectable facade? That's the question we need to start with. Not with emotional assessments, but with an attempt to understand what behaviorally significant conclusions can be drawn from the available materials. If we look at all this data as a whole, the analytical approach proposed by some authors boils down to the following. Dvorkin's biography can be viewed as more than just a biography of a complex, contradictory individual or one with an internal conflict. From a certain perspective, it also appears as a sort of a trajectory where, according to these interpretations, the same themes keep popping up again and again: power, control, moral superiority, fear, death, guilt, narcissistic vulnerability, and its possible compensation through exerting influence over others. And throughout this entire video, I want you to keep one simple thing in mind. The most important point in stories like these isn't to be the first one to shout. The most important point is not to miss the moment when a set of scattered facts begin to form a profile. And a profile isn't just a random collection of episodes. A profile is repetition. A profile is an internal logic. A profile is a line that runs through various stages of life while preserving its structure: childhood, adolescence, career, speech, self-presentation style, attitudes to death, humiliation, power, and other people's vulnerabilities. It is this very line that we are going to examine now. In the materials I mentioned at the beginning, in particular James Ressler's book, The Analytical Report by Independent Journalists of the Act Files portals, the authors built this reconstruction not from a single random episode, but from several groups of sources that, when compared, begin to function as a mutually complementary informational materials. The first set of sources in this study consists of Alexander Dvorkin's own texts, primarily his autobiographical books, Teachers and Lessons, and My America. Such texts are particularly valuable for psychological, biographical, and behavioral analysis, as autobiographical writing is almost never a neutral record of the past. When a person speaks publicly about themselves, they aren't just reporting facts. They're inevitably constructing a particular version of their own life, creating an image of themselves for the audience, setting a framework for interpreting events, and distributing semantic emphasis. In this sense, not only the information itself is significant, but also the way it's arranged. What exactly the author emphasizes, what he downplays, explains, or justifies, which episodes are brought to the forefront, and which are pushed to the sidelines of the narrative. And like I mentioned earlier, this approach is consistent with the logic of retrospective psychological and psychobiographical analysis, where personal texts are viewed not as direct evidence of internal motives, but as important material for developing substantiated interpretations of the author's personality, systems of values, enduring experiences, and methods of self-presentation. Therefore, in this case, the research interest isn't just in the biographical facts that Dvorkin decided were worth remembering and sharing with the public, but also in the narrative structure of his autobiographies. Intonation, recurring themes, system of emphasis, emotional tone, attitude to his own past, methods of explaining conflicts, self-justification, or, conversely, demonstrative highlighting of certain traumatic, significant, or symbolically charged episodes. In other words, the subject of analysis is not merely what is being told, but also how the story is constructed, because the author's personality is often revealed indirectly through the speech patterns, the logic of selecting events, how their memory is structured, and how they craft their public biography. The second source is an interview from 1979, recorded in New York City as part of a project about recent Soviet immigrants in America, back when Alexander Dvorkin was just 25 years old. From an analytical perspective, it's a particularly meaningful source because there's a relatively short time gap between the events of his youth and the interview itself. In other words, here we don't yet see a Dvorkin of his later years, not a fully formed ideologist of the anti-cult network and a man with a polished role as a respectable professor and church expert. This is important because at this stage, his self-presentation hadn't yet undergone the years of public honing. The interview was given by a young Russian immigrant who had recently left the Soviet Union, which means his statements were closer to his original life experiences. There's a lot less of the later revision of his self-image, and because of that, there's a much higher chance that his speech captures more immediate reactions, spontaneous accents, and involuntary utterances that may have been subsequently smoothed out or entirely suppressed in later autobiographical writings. The third body of evidence consists of his medical records. They are absolutely vital for the analysis, as they introduce a layer of information significantly less controlled by the subject, and therefore allowing for a comparison of his public image with data that arose outside his later self-presentation. These records contain complaints, symptoms, doctors' observations, diagnostic notes, statements from his mother, and records of his emotional instability, use of psychoactive substances, and episodes of suicidal behavior. So the medical records are a crucial source. They allow us to see aspects of Dvorkin's life and psychological conditions that are much harder to subsequently rework into ideological or biographical contexts. The fourth source is the book Kalalatsky by Arkady Rovner. As noted in the almanac, Acta Samistatika, this novel is based on oral stories of A.L. Dvorkin, who was a member of the Moscow system. What gives this even more weight is that, in his book, My America, Dvorkin himself confirms that he knew Rovner, referring to him as Arkady Grodner and describing him as sort of his mentor. For this very reason, the text has immense analytical value. It was written when Dvorkin was about 25, the exact same time frame as his 1979 interview, long before his later public image fully formed, and before he developed sustainable skills for consciously controlling how he presented himself. By comparing biographical details, behavioral traits, and recurring plot points, some authors have suggested that Dvorkin might actually be the character Kostylopuhov in Rovner's book. When comparing Dvorkin's later autobiographical texts with this early narrative reflection of his past, the same themes, emotional reactions, and key episodes pop up over and over again. Themes of shame, guilt, death, power, blood, alienation from the collective environment keep recurring along with a tense and ambivalent attitude to the image of God. And it's this recurrence that is most valuable for the analysis. Not an isolated detail itself, but its return across different texts, at different times, and in different forms. In fact, in behavioral and psychobiographical analysis, consistently recurring motifs most often point to deep-seated inner conflicts that can subsequently manifest not only in speech, but also in life trajectory, system of beliefs, and the methods of influencing others. Like I mentioned earlier, from a forensic and behavioral perspective, Serial killers typically don't appear out of nowhere. Their criminal behavior is almost always looked at within a broader biographical and psychological context, including prior life experiences, development of fantasies, stable emotional reactions, and ways of interacting with other people. Now, a criminal's modus operandi, the practical way of committing a crime, usually evolves and changes as they gain more experience. But their signature, if present, is more often associated with more stable internal psychological needs and fantasies. Researchers also point out that biographies of some serial killers often reveal early traumatic experiences, family dysfunction, psychopathic or antisocial traits, and other psychopathological factors of a mental disorder. Based on a comparison of available materials, Alexander Dvorkin grew up in a family environment that could hardly be described as a psychologically stable or emotionally safe. His father left the family early, and Dvorkin himself later stated outright that he basically grew up without a father. This fact is important as an element of an overall family setup. According to sources, his grandfather played a significant role in this system, being a harsh, hot-tempered, and oppressive man. We know he was a victim of Stalin's repressions and was released from a labor camp. In the novel Kalalatsi, the grandfather is portrayed as a source of brutal force, judgment, and pressure. His mother, on the other hand, is described as having excessively high expectations of her son. Dvorkin's medical records indicate that his older sister was treated in a mental health clinic since childhood, was registered with a psychiatrist, and had a disability due to a birth injury. The same autobiographical element is also noted in episodes of Arkady Rovner's book Kalalatsi, where the sister of the main character, the one associated with Alexander Dvorkin, also suffered from severe mental health issues. That's important to consider too as part of the overall family atmosphere characterized by tension, instability, and enhanced emotional stress. Against this backdrop, Dvorkin's autobiographical texts consistently repeat the themes of school humiliation, clumsiness, shame about his appearance, absence of close friends, systematic beatings by classmates, and social awkwardness. In Kalalatsi, this layer is particularly pronounced. The main character, again, relatable to young Dvorkin's own oral stories, describes himself as a boy who was beaten, ignored, ashamed of who he was, grew up without a father, and lived under constant pressure and humiliation from his own family. Taken together, these elements paint a picture of an early environment characterized by a lack of stable support, a high degree of external control, chronic feelings of shame, and struggles with social integration. And it's exactly this kind of configuration that becomes incredibly important for further behavioral analysis. From the perspective of psychobiographical and forensic psychological analysis, this family dynamic involves several factors that the scientific literature views not as direct causes, but rather as key risk factors for developing antisocial and maladaptive behavioral patterns. Firstly, the absence of a stable father figure and overall family instability are frequently cited in studies of serial and sexual killers as recurring biographical elements. When combined with other adverse conditions, these factors can contribute to the formation of compensatory strategies centered around control, dominance, and the pursuit of power. Secondly, family stigmatization, chronic experiences of shame, and a sense of inferiority can be understood within the context of literature on pathological narcissism as the conditions for defensive grandiosity and vulnerable self-esteem. Thirdly, emotional deprivation and the lack of an emotionally safe environment during critical developmental periods have been consistently linked in studies on attachment and developmental psychopathology to emotional regulation disorders, a profound lack of empathy, and a heightened risk of antisocial behavior. Take, for example, a study focusing on 50 serial killers whose motive was sexual gratification. It found that 50% of them had experienced psychological abuse in childhood, 36% had suffered physical abuse, and 26% sexual abuse, while the rate of neglect stood at 18%. The authors noted that the rates of psychological, physical, and sexual abuse within this group were significantly higher than comparable societal norms. But there's one particular marker that James Ressler, the author of The Serial Killer Against God, simply couldn't overlook as an experienced profiler with over 30 years in the Bureau. After finishing the second grade, meaning he was about 8 years old, Alexander Dvorkin was sent to a pioneer summer camp, and just 2 weeks in, he climbed the fence and ran away. Dvorkin himself writes in his memoirs that the experience of living in a camp under bugle and drum was sharply negative for him. So in his book, James Ressler asks a very logical question. What on earth could have happened to an 8-year-old boy at that camp to make him choose the risk and guaranteed punishment of running away, just to escape whatever was going on there? From an analytical perspective, an act like this can be viewed as a form of extreme avoidance, a reaction where the internal feeling of threat becomes far stronger than the fear of any external consequences. And that is exactly why James Ressler puts forward the hypothesis that this episode wasn't just some childish rebellion against discipline. It could point to a much deeper traumatic experience, potentially including physical or sexual abuse. According to the book, The Serial Killer Against God, which, as the author himself states, relies heavily in this section on testimonies gathered by Viktor Fridman, there is an account detailing a severe incident of violence against a younger student that dates back to Dvorkin's high school years, right around the age of 15. In his book, Ressler outlines an allegation that the subject, identified in the text as Alexander Dvorkin, committed an act of physical and sexual violence. Following the attack, according to these very same testimonies, the victim was thrown into a construction pit while still alive and pelted with stones. Next, I'm going to share some excerpts from Viktor Fridman's book, The Kremlin Maniac, which James Ressler references in his work. I have to warn you right now, the descriptions we're about to cover are extremely heavy and deeply traumatic. So, if you're particularly sensitive to this kind of content, I strongly recommend skipping this next section of the video and rejoining us after it's over.
The first thing Sashka did was tear the gray scarf from the boy. He used it to bind the boy's hands behind his back, pulling it so tight that the knots dug into the child's skin. And then he raped him, there, on the concrete slabs, amid gray dust and rusted rebar.
But that's not all. The testimony continues.
Sashka took the gray scarf and the boy's school bag and threw them into the pit, down to where their first grader was already lying. And then he began throwing stones into the pit with force. He ordered Zaykashka to do the same, but the boy was still breathing. He was alive when the first hail of stones came crashing down on his head. They buried him alive. But the most horrifying thing in the entire scene was the laughter. Sashka Dvorkin was laughing wildly, hysterically. He was shouting something incoherent, choking on that infernal laughter as the stones shattered the boy's bones.
I'm sure for those of you who have been following my channel for a long time and are already familiar with the materials I collected about Alexander Dvorkin's network are accustomed to the fact that new shocking facts regularly emerge in this case. But I confess, even I was truly shocked by this testimony. Naturally, testimonies like these demand independent and extremely rigorous verification. But even at this stage of the analysis, we can pinpoint several factors that hold significant analytical weight. 1. Information comes from 2 independent sources: the testimonies of the individuals mentioned in Fridman's book, which are cited by Ressler, and the biographical details mirrored in Arkady Ravner's novel Kalaladze, which was written long before Dvorkin ever built his public image as an anti-cult figure. 2. According to Ressler's analysis, the character in Kalalatsi, whose biography perfectly matches Dvorkin's, Kostyelopouhov, is described in a context that mentions a boy named Yasha and these events that surround him. These events directly correlate with the descriptions of Zaykashka found in Fridman's material. 3. In his own book, My America, the subject himself mentions Arkady Rovner under the pseudonym Arkady Grodner. By doing so, he confirms his acquaintance with the author of the novel Kalalatsi. And right at the beginning of this autobiographical book, he explicitly states all events in this book are real. Some names have been changed. 4. From the perspective of behavioral analysis, if the incident described in these testimonies actually occurred, it has to be viewed as a highly significant early act of violence. It is a key indicator of how a future pattern of violent behavior begins to take root. In the English language forensic literature, episodes like this are typically classified as early markers of subsequent violence, or as precursor elements in the evolution of a violent behavioral pattern. Researchers consistently emphasize that early aggressive behavior is frequently linked to a much higher risk of severe, repeated violence down the road, especially when combined with pronounced antisocial or psychopathic traits. But there's another hidden storyline buried in this biography, and according to the books by James Ressler and Viktor Fridman, as well as the psychobiographical analysis conducted by the independent journalists from the Act Files portal, it unfolds just a little bit later, during that exact same 9th grade year. And the central figure in this story is Yasha. Yasha's story is the core nerve of all material I'm analyzing today. In Kalalatsi, Yasha, and based on the comparative analysis in Viktor Fridman's book, he appears in the testimonies as Zaykashka, the stutterer, is Dvorkin's classmate from elementary school, quiet, sickly, stuttering, perpetually guilty, living with his grandmother, going to church. This is a highly important figure. It is through Yasha that the theme of God enters Dvorkin's early biography. In one episode of Kalalatsi, Yasha speaks of God as a force that can extend a hand and get anyone. For a child's mind, this isn't just an abstract conversation about religion. It is simultaneously an image of an ultimate power, punishment, mystery, and an unreachable control. And, as James Ressler emphasizes in his interpretation, this very image then starts coming back in various forms in later texts and episodes, taking on a deeper and deeper psychological significance. Moving on, if we follow the logic of the analyzed materials, an event occurs that sharply alters the direction of the entire biographical thread. At the end of the 9th grade, Dvorkin's close friend, Yasha, is pulled dead from the Solkliniki ponds. It's this exact episode that becomes pivotal for the subsequent psychobiographical analysis. In the Act Files material, several text fragments are compared, and this comparison is particularly significant. In Kalalatsi, which in this context is treated as an early literary reflection of biographical material, the death of a friend is handled with an almost terrifying emotional restraint. Alyona, a close friend of Yasha, and Kostya Lopukov, who a number of authors equate with the young Dvorkin, mourns his death. There's a mention of a funeral somewhere in Peredelkino, a district in Moscow, but the episode itself is presented as if it were just passing through the text, mentioned almost as an afterthought, with no profound grief, no fully developed emotional reaction, almost like a side note. Many years pass after the writing of Kalalatsi, and a different fragment pops up in My America. Dvorkin recalls how, when he was still a schoolboy, the son of one of his mother's friends drowned, and after that, they hid him from her so as not to remind her of the dead boy. He writes that he was terrified of the moment her tall, heavy figure would appear in the corridor at his mother's workplace, so he would duck into the nearest room and hide behind a cabinet. Comparing this fragment with the earlier text, as well as with the episode from Viktor Fridman's book, becomes one of James Ressler's key analytical moves. In The Serial Killer Against God, he interprets both of these episodes, the scene from Kalalatsi and the memory from My America as potential reflections of the same exact event, the murder of Yasha. Later on, this line becomes even more psychologically challenging. In Kalalatsi, there's an episode involving a visit to Yasha's grave. Ressler pays particular attention to it because this is exactly where a whole knot of motifs is concentrated. Motifs that, within the framework of behavioral and psychobiographical analysis, are hard to write off as mere coincidence. This scene features the grave of the dead friend, the face of the drowned boy, a wound on a hand, blood on the snow, an experience as if something dark and agonizing had exited the protagonist, a view of the dead Yasha as a figure of torment and gravity, the motif of talking to the dead, a feeling of sheer terror, an empty train platform, and then boredom and shame when trying to capture it all in writing. In his book, James Ressler sees these scenes as a reconstruction of trauma, guilt, and the internal release following a committed murder, expressed through symbolic imagery. Why Ressler comes to this specific conclusion makes a lot more sense when you factor in materials he's relying on. Specifically, the testimonies laid out in Viktor Fridman's book. And here, I have to bring in the relevant quote. Podružka or Alyona knew the truth because Zaykashka knew everything about the day Dvorkin killed the first grader and forced Zaykashka to help cover the pit with stones. She knew that Sashka had eliminated the sole witness to his first murder, but she stayed silent. Fear, fueled by drugs, proved stronger than conscience. When Zaykashka was buried, Podružka wept for days on end, and Sashka didn't even attend the funeral. As he later told Podružka, he hadn't gone because he would have been bored at the funeral. In reality, he feared the anger of Zaykashka's mother, who had already been openly accusing him, clearly sensing the truth. This was made even worse by the fact that Zaykashka's mother was a friend and colleague of Dvorkin's own mother. In Kalalatsi, the main character, who is associated with Alexander Dvorkin, utters a phrase, quote, "I first woke up in the 9th grade when Yasha died, and ever since, I've been watching myself from the outside." The author of The Serial Killer Against God emphasizes that this is essentially the language of dissociation. It's the language of a person who, following some extreme, boundary-shattering event, which, based on the testimonies recorded in Viktor Fridman's book, can be interpreted as murder, seemingly detaches from himself and begins observing his own life as if through a pane of glass. One can argue about the degree of interpretation here. One can debate how far the authors go in their conclusions and how rigidly they link specific text fragments to these alleged events. But despite all that, it's hard to ignore one crucial point. In this biographical construct, Yasha's death truly acts as a watershed moment. Following this episode, the trajectory of his biography begins to shift dramatically. Medical records indicate that it was precisely in the 9th grade that Dvorkin started having conflicts with his mother and began consuming alcohol. That is a very specific timestamp. Not sometime later, not gradually, exactly starting in the 9th grade. In the 9th grade, a new student, Tolya Weinberg, appeared in Dvorkin's circle. In his autobiographical texts, Tolya was the first to introduce Dvorkin to the hippie community. In Kalalatsi, a similar character arrives bringing new clothes, long hair, and drugs. Dvorkin's life undergoes a radical overhaul, and the function all of this begins to serve is also important. In Kalalatsi, there is a line delivered by Kostya Lopukhov, a character modeled after Alexander Dvorkin.
At 17, I realized something. The high was the way out. I'm hypnotized. I cannot wake up even from death. But there are seconds of semi-awakening from music, conversation, and junk. It's like an alarm clock in the morning. Jump up and run. The purpose of the system was to generate the high. The high was work beyond the ordinary world. Systems produce masters of the high.
In the Act Files article, this thread is traced very methodically. the substance use, the escape into a subculture, the departure from a normative environment, breaking free from family control, and fleeing from his own internal conflict. According to Alexander Dvorkin's autobiographical texts and the novel Kalalatsi, in the period between finishing school and immigrating to the U.S. in 1977, Dvorkin enrolled in a pedagogical institute, but was expelled for, quote, not fitting the moral standards of a teacher. Thanks to preserved archival data from the Russian media portal, Tribuna, it's pretty clear what was meant by not fitting the moral standards of a teacher. Quote, in his younger years, Dvorkin engaged in toxicomania and took other drugs, which likely served as the reason for his emigration to the United States. As his classmate reported, he was expelled from the institute. He was forced to emigrate because he felt he was being drawn into a certain lifestyle, unquote. Another classmate testified, quote, Dvorkin was completely non-aggressive because he cared little about the reality around him, especially if he was under the influence of some substance. He simply didn't attend classes or would show up with his friends in a somewhat detached state. At the Pedagogical Institute, a person who wandered the hallways in an incoherent state, stumbling in the corners, was undesirable to the administration, unquote. A further detail complementing these testimonies, noted by James Ressler in his book, was Dvorkin's involvement in the, quote, system subculture, as recorded in Kalalatsi. Dvorkin, appearing under the name Kostyelopuhov, was an active participant in the Moscow hippie subculture known as the System. According to the descriptions in Kalalatsi, this environment was characterized by intense promiscuous sexual relations and drug experimentation. Adding to this picture is a statement Alexander Dvorkin made in a 1979 interview regarding what he did while living in Russia prior to moving to the United States.
Well, I have just much less spare time here than I had there. There, practically all the time was mine. There I was getting stoned all the time, but here I don't.
The report on the Act Files portal includes a detailed section on polydrug addiction. The key point to note from the analysis is a neuroimaging study of addiction, supported by the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse. It shows that chronic substance abuse and intoxication disrupt functioning of the prefrontal cortex in drug addicts. This reduces frustration tolerance, impairs impulse control and the ability to evaluate consequences, which increases aggression and antisocial behavior, and explains the impulsive and risky behavior of drug addicts. Neuropsychiatric studies also note that individuals with criminal behavior and a propensity for violent crime often have an impaired prefrontal cortex. When combined with addiction, the risk of aggression increases dramatically. Continuing the review of James Ressler's book, when examining Alexander Dvorkin's biographical data, he draws attention to a number of episodes that, in his interpretation, correlate with characteristics that forensic science associates with psychopathic characteristics and various forms of problematic behavior. For example, episodes in the medical facility. After being expelled from the institute, by Alexander Dvorkin's own account, he found a job as an orderly in an intensive care unit of the Cardiology Institute at Moscow's Hospital Number 67. Now, I ask you to pause for a second and really grasp what I'm talking about. A man, some of the analyzed materials, is associated with drugs, violence, and death, finds himself alongside those who cannot defend themselves, severely ill patients in an intensive care unit. And that is exactly why this biographical turning point is so analytically significant. Because from here, drawing on testimonies gathered by Viktor Fridman, Ressler moves on to even more disturbing episodes. According to these accounts, During his time working at this medical facility, the subject, as he referred to in the book, experimented with medication dosages given to patients in the intensive care unit, which ultimately led to fatal consequences. If we keep looking at this through the lens of the behavioral analysis that James Ressler uses, access to vulnerable individuals, patients in critical condition, combined with the described interests in substances from the school period, represents a highly significant marker in the construction of a behavioral profile. In forensic literature, these kinds of circumstances are typically associated with so-called medical predators, or as they're more commonly known, angels of death. While working as an orderly in the ICU of the 67th Moscow City Hospital, Dvorkin, according to the information laid out in Viktor Fridman's book, gained unrestricted access to helpless, dying patients, as well as to highly potent medications. And it was there, according to this interpretation, that his God complex fully took shape, a pathological need to decide who gets to live and who has to die, getting a thrill out of having power over human agony. Now, when we talk about polymorphic criminal activity, it means the perpetrator doesn't just stick to one type of victim or one specific method of committing a crime. The term points to the lack of any narrow specialization in a potential offender. It shows that the driving force isn't some specific fetish or scenario, but rather a general antisocial orientation of their personality, a fundamental need for violence as such. In this context, there's one more analytically significant detail we have to mention, one that's viewed as a crucial piece of his entire psychobiographical reconstruction: Alexander Dvorkin's psychiatric history. On your screen right now, you can see the sources indicating he was diagnosed with cyclothymia. That's an affective spectrum disorder involving mood swings between subdepressive and hypomanic states. When you combine that with the factors we've already covered, the family instability, the substance abuse, the documented violence, and the signs of a persistent urge to cause psychological and physical harm to others, this diagnosis becomes a highly significant part of a much broader behavioral picture. Following the logic of the materials we're analyzing, it's exactly this combination of traits that forms a personality profile comparable to that of a highly organized, violent serial offender. In his book, The Serial Killer Against God, James Ressler points out the following.
That's why Dvorkin didn't stay in that ICU forever. Killing in secret, in the darkness of a hospital ward, became too small for him. His narcissism, bloated to pathological proportions, demanded a stage. He needed to step out of the shadows while maintaining the power to destroy people. And he found a brilliant way to do it, by rebranding his sadistic tendencies as a socially sanctioned mission. Instead of a syringe, he uses a podium. Instead of poison, the tools of dehumanization.
In the same book, the chapter covering Alexander Dvorkin's emigration to the U.S. is titled The American Incubator. That title alone sets the interpretive framework. The author doesn't just treat this American phase as a mere biographical episode, but rather as an environment where his personality continued to take shape and where specific behavioral patterns became deeply ingrained. If we follow this logic, upon arriving in the United States, Dvorkin starts building a brand new identity. He's no longer the marginalized Soviet teenager or a student on a deviant path. He is now a man with a completely different social status, a Bachelor of Arts, a theologian, and an insider in religious and ideological circles. In other words, we're not just talking about a change of scenery, but a complete transformation of his social persona and symbolic standing. At the same time, according to information broadcasts on the Russian TV show Vermechko, Alexander Dvorkin becomes connected with the notoriously controversial organization, CAN, the Cult Awareness Network. This group was made up of individuals who, according to numerous testimonies, exhibited similar deviant traits. You had Ted Patrick, the founder of CAN, who was repeatedly convicted for his criminal involvement in kidnappings, Rick Allen Ross, who faced lawsuits over his activities tied to forced deprogramming, and Stephen Hesson, who appears in several sources linked to practices involving involuntary deprogramming, kidnappings, unlawful detention, and other severe abuses, all carried out under the banner of fighting cults. Moreover, American court records and archival sources have documented that activities associated with CAN and the broader anti-cult deprogramming scene were, in a number of cases, accompanied by kidnapping, unlawful detention, and other forms of physical and sexual violence. And this is exactly why this context is analytically important. It shows the ideological and practical environment in which Dvorkin's continued development took place during his American period. What matters here isn't just the fact that he was in this environment, but the likely influence it had on shaping his later rhetoric. A comparative analysis of his publications, lectures, interviews, and public appearances reveals that his vocabulary, terminology, and narrative structure show a clear borrowing from the anti-cult rhetoric that was previously developed and popularized in the U.S. environment by Stephen Hesson. What's more, comparative linguistic analysis raises a serious question. Isn't a massive chunk of what Dvorkin later passed off as his own original sectology concept essentially just an adapted retelling of existing American anti-cult blueprints? But even against this backdrop, perhaps the most crucial factors in analyzing this American chapter aren't just the questions of an environment and ideological influence. There's a whole series of other circumstances to consider. Specifically, episodes tied to the deaths of several people in Dvorkin's immediate inner circle, individuals who acted as his mentors, patrons, or figures who helped advance his career. Alexander Dvorkin, December 1983. Protopresbyter, Dean of St. Vladimir Seminary, died of cancer. John Meyendorff, July 1992. Archpriest, Schmeemann's successor as dean, died of cancer. Gleb Kaleta, November 1994. Archpriest, scientist, and Dvorkin supervisor after his return to Russia, died of cancer. Now, I'd like you to pay close attention to one specific detail here. All three of them died of cancer. I'll be breaking this section down in much greater detail later on, but for now, it's crucial to pin down what James Ressler points out. Every single one of these deaths chronologically aligns with stages of Dvorkin's social, academic, or career advancement. On top of that, these men weren't strangers to him. They were his mentors and patrons. Because of their close and prolonged interaction with him within educational and church environments, these were figures who were in a position to see right past his social mask. They could observe his true personality traits, including those pathological and deviant patterns we've been unpacking today. What gives this even more weight is how Dvorkin himself describes these deaths in his memoirs. Ressler specifically highlights this phrasing, quote, a feeling of a specific presence, a visitation from God, a culmination, an achievement, a victory, unquote. If we look at this through the lens of narrative analysis, using the word victory in the context of death of someone close to you comes across as a highly atypical effective marker. It points to a very specific, unusual emotional connection to the event of death itself. In research studies, reactions like this are viewed as potentially linked to perceiving another person's death in one of three ways: as the removal of an obstacle, as a validation of one's own power, or as a manifestation of deeply identifying with the role of someone who holds the power to decide the fates of others. So, based on the materials we've analyzed, we've pinned down his psychobiographical trajectory: a childhood spent in a pathological family environment, initial acts of violence in the 9th grade, drug addiction, work in the ICU, where fatal manipulations involving drugs are performed on helpless patients, emigration to the U.S., building a brand new social and ideological identity, and a series of deaths among his mentors. If we follow the logic proposed by James Ressler, a mechanism well known in behavioral analysis begins to emerge. Once a predator exhausts the opportunities of their current environment, they change their location, but not their internal structure. In this interpretation, the American phase acts as a sort of incubator for Dvorkin. It's exactly where he acquires what he lacked before: a respectable mask of a theologian, an institutional vocabulary, ideological cover, and exposure to an environment where the practice of forced deprogramming was pitched as a fight for salvation. In other words, within this interpretation, we're talking about a shift to a whole new level. While earlier problematic episodes in his biographical materials are captured somewhat fragmentarily, like incidents described in some sources as violent or deviant, in this later phase, according to these analyses, they are repackaged into a framework that appears far more socially acceptable. For example, this is achieved through expert discourse, religious rhetoric, or activities aimed at fighting dangerous cults. And that is exactly why his return to Russia is, in Ressler's logic, the next step. Dvorkin comes back in 1992, and right from that moment, he essentially kicks off the rapid construction of an institutional machine based on anti-cult ideology, one that gradually gains access to church, expert, media, and state mechanisms. If we look at this timeline through an investigative lens, a very specific, step-by-step model of institutional influence and regulatory impact on state structures starts taking shape. In 1992, right after moving back to Russia, Dvorkin started working in the Department for Religious Education and Catechization of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. This department coordinated spiritual and moral education and managed the church's interaction with state educational bodies. 1993. The founding of the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, and this happens with the official blessing of Patriarch Alexei II. This grants Dvorkin his first major institutional asset, the status of a defender of a country's titular religion, and alongside with it, a massive symbolic shield. But the most important stuff is happening in the shadows. That same year, in 1993, Dvorkin travels to Aarhus, Denmark, to study under Johannes Agard, a man who, according to a number of sources, inherited the methodologies of the Nazi Apologetic Center, led by Walter Kunith. What matters here isn't just the training itself, but the circle of people who were present during it. It's in places exactly like this that the transnational ties begin to form, ties that eventually operate as a network. And there's actually a cell of this network right here in the Czech Republic. But I'll tell you more about that a little later. 2006. Ratziers is created, the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects. At this point, we're no longer looking at an isolated center. It's an umbrella organization uniting anti-sectarian nodes attached to dioceses and affiliated institutions all across the country. Simply put, by this stage, Dvorkin doesn't just have a platform, he has his own vertical of power. And then comes 2009. This is the year James Ressler, in his book, The Serial Killer Against God, considers the turning point. In his interpretation, it's the moment of ultimate institutional triumph. Dvorkin simultaneously becomes the head of the expert council for conducting state religious evaluations under the Russian Ministry of Justice, and the vice president of FECRIS, the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Cults and Sects. Let's really process what just happened. The exact same man, with no specialized academic background in religious studies, with a psychiatric history, documented long-term drug use from a young age, and, according to the sources we've analyzed, trailing a wake of deaths, potentially including the murders of a little boy and ninth-grade friend, simultaneously took the helm of a state expert body in Russia and secured a top leadership role in European organization with international standing. Do you know what that actually meant? It meant that his anti-cult classifications and his terminology started receiving two massive sources of legitimacy at once: state and international. In other words, the exact same ideological anti-cult framework began to function simultaneously as an internal expert consensus in Russia and as an outwardly respectable stance on international platforms. And who actually appointed him to this state position? Former Justice Minister Alexander Konovalov, who, according to numerous sources, was Dvorkin's former student at the St. Tikhon's Orthodox Institute. This detail alone warrants a separate analysis, because it brings us not just to formal appointments, but to the personal connections through which, according to some interpretations, specific ideological frameworks of anti-cult initiatives were able to spread through selected political and institutional circles, potentially reaching all the way to the presidential administration. But that's a topic for another deep dive. So, how exactly can this mechanism, attributed to the anti-cult network, actually kill? How does it shatter people's lives? If we analyze human rights reports from USCIRF and other organizations documenting violations of human rights and freedoms, cross-examine the publications released by representatives of the anti-cult network, and map out their international chains of connections and the way they reference one another, we can get much closer to reconstructing their exact methodology. This model can then be broken down into several sequential stages of a very specific operational logic. Based on the materials we've analyzed, this logic plays out in various forms across a whole range of countries, including Russia, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Italy, France, the US, China, and other jurisdictions where the presence of anti-cult initiatives has been documented. The first stage is stigmatizing labeling. The target group singled out by representatives of the anti-cult network is branded with a stigmatizing label: a sect, a cult, or a totalitarian sect. The core function of this label is to strip the target of their status as a normal member of society and push them into a category of an outsider, someone who is not like everyone else, different, or outright dangerous. The second stage is a pseudo-expert legitimization. Once that initial labeling is done, affiliated experts, religious scholars, and sect specialists or cult experts jump into the process. Through publications, interviews, conferences, and media appearances, they give this original stigmatization a veneer of scientific and academic validity. In other words, the label stops sounding like just someone's private opinion and starts sounding like a scientifically backed expert conclusion. The third stage is securitization, framing the group as a security threat. During this phase, the manufactured sectarian threat is deliberately translated into the language of national security, extremism, terrorism, and public safety. It's exactly at this point that the anti-cult network gets the opportunity to drag not just the media and pseudo-experts into their persecution campaign, but also law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, and administrative bodies. The reason is simple. By this stage, the target is no longer presented merely as an inconvenient, misunderstood, or alternative group, but as an alleged threat to the state, to society, and to public order. And the moment this bait and switch takes hold, the most dangerous part begins. The state apparatus steps in, not to protect the rights of its own law-abiding citizens, but to suppress and repress them, all under the guise of fighting a perceived threat. Which brings us to the fourth stage, the abuse of legal mechanisms. At this point, the pressure shifts to the legal and procedural level. You start seeing petitions to the prosecutor's office initiated by anti-cult activists, mass complaints, police raids, and court trials where pseudo-expert evaluations with predetermined conclusions play a massive role. The materials we're analyzing stress that these evaluations are churned out by the very same anti-cult network that first artificially manufactured the accusatory narrative, and then turns around and provides its own expert justification to back it up. I actually broke this down in detail in one of my previous videos. And the fifth stage is the social disintegration of the target group or individual at the hands of the anti-cult network. The end result here is the complete breakdown of the social fabric surrounding a person or a group. People lose their jobs, their family and professional ties are shattered, and they are subjected to a severe psychological trauma. In a number of documented cases, this process has even been accompanied by direct violence, or has driven people to suicide. Following James Ressler's logic, it is precisely this effect, marginalization, isolation, and elimination, that is viewed as one of the key outcomes of the entire anti-cult system. And that is exactly why, if we look at the behavioral analysis materials, Alexander Dvorkin doesn't come across as a lone actor. Within this interpretation, what emerges around him is a picture of a multi-level, transnational networks where, according to the materials we've analyzed, specific functions are clearly delegated. Some people manufacture the labels, others provide the expert cover, a third group pushes these frameworks into the media and legal spheres, while the rest apply pressure on the local level. Meanwhile, Alexander Dvorkin himself claims that, officially, no such thing as an anti-cult organization even exists. Just take a look at this clip.
Антисектантское движение, я принадлежу к антисектантскому движению, но никакой секты у нас, в принципе, у нас нет организации. Секта – это организация, в которой есть свой лидер, свои члены, свои правила и так далее.
His followers generally take a similar stance. There is no network. But we need to make a crucial clarification here. From the perspective of law and the analysis of organized crime or coordinated activity, the existence of a network or collusion doesn't come down to a single signed document, a charter, or one formally registered entity. What actually matters are completely different indicators: a shared goal, coordinated actions, the division of roles, and the reproducibility of a single behavioral model. The Nuremberg trials convicted Nazi war criminals in exactly this way. They didn't have a single master document with everyone's signature on it. Their guilt was proven through a unified ideology, a shared goal, and coordinated actions. So the next question is, if this isn't just a random assortment of disconnected individuals, how exactly is this system structured? If we operate on the premise that this isn't just a formal organization in the strict bureaucratic sense, but rather a reproducible network with a shared ideology, a common goal, and coordinated actions, then we can actually break down its internal architecture level by level. The first level of this structure, according to some of the materials we've analyzed, is the ideological core. This is represented by entities like the Center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons and the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, Ratsirs. According to available sources, it's exactly within these structures that specific classification frameworks and terminology are forged, frameworks used to brand certain groups as sects, destructive cults, or totalitarian groups. In other words, within this interpretation, this is where the language is engineered, a language that can later be weaponized as a tool for social exclusion, delegitimization, and targeted pressure against these groups. The second level is international legitimization, and that is FECRIS, the European platform that grants this anti-cult agenda a veneer of external respectability. Holding consultative status with international institutions gives an outside observer the impression that this isn't just some ideological campaign, but rather a recognized, authoritative, and institutionally legitimate expert body. And I want to emphasize something very specifically here. It is a documented fact that FECRIS receives financial backing from the French government. So, according to some interpretations, we have to consider the very real possibility that European taxpayer money is being funneled into supporting an environment whose observable patterns involve coordinated information campaigns, stigmatization, and systematic pressure. Tactics that, on an analytical level, are sometimes compared to the logic of information operations and the broader mechanisms of hybrid warfare. The third level consists of national executive nodes. This is exactly where the overarching ideology gets translated into localized campaigns. At this level, we aren't just looking at the core centers anymore. We are looking at specific figures on the ground: journalists, pseudo-experts, religious scholars, activists, and administrative proxies. They take the broad anti-cult narrative and tailor it to fit the political, legal, and media landscape of a given country. And this is where things get truly revealing, because the moment we step down from the theoretical flowchart to these levels of a specific country, it becomes glaringly obvious exactly how this system operates in practice. Let's take a look at Ukraine. And to illustrate this, I'm going to share an excerpt that James Ressler references in his book.
Irina Kremenovskaya, director of the Center for Economic and Legal Research and the online portal Hovory, has become a significant figure in Russia's anti-cult movement operating in Ukraine, effectively acting as an agent of the Russian Orthodox Church. Following the departure of another key figure, Pavel Broida, Kremenovskaya has attempted to fill the position of the chief anti-cultist within the Russian Association of Centers for Study of Religions and Sects, RATSEERS, in Ukraine. Substantial evidence suggests that her rhetoric and actions closely mirror Russian disinformation campaigns, indicating direct coordination with a Russian anti-cult network led by Alexander Dvorkin. This collaboration appears designed to fracture Ukrainian society, undermine fundamental rights and freedoms, and justify the aggressor's military actions on Ukrainian territory.
Cross-referencing the materials available online gives us solid grounds to conclude, and James Ressler points out this specifically in his book, The Serial Killer Against God, that Irina Kremenovskaya was closely connected to the dog hunter community. These are groups that practice the systematic, brutal killing of stray animals. And here is the most crucial takeaway. This isn't just some random biographical detail about a random person. We are talking about a dedicated, ideological follower of the anti-cult network, coordinated by Alexander Dvorkin out of Moscow. That means this fact has to be examined within the context of the overall internal logic of this entire environment. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, this is absolutely fundamental. In criminological and clinical psychology literature, animal abuse has long been recognized as a glaring red flag for aggression and deviant behavior, especially when the abuse is systematic and driven by a fixation on inflicting pain, exerting control, and acting with impunity. And that is exactly why James Ressler looks at the Kremenovskaya case and doesn't see a change in the underlying behavior, but rather a shift in the target and the tools. First, it was the animals. Then, it was people. First, it was the direct infliction of physical pain. Then, it became harassment, persecution, fabricated accusations, and applying pressure through legal and pseudo-expert mechanisms. When you frame this within the context of Dvorkin's anti-cult network, it becomes blatantly obvious. The form might change, but the internal logic of the violence stays exactly the same. What's particularly telling here is that even as her involvement in the killing of dogs was coming to light publicly in Ukraine, Kremenovskaya herself kept right on spinning her image as a defender of society against the threat of stray dog attacks. But let's call things what they really are. Based on the materials we have, can talking about the twisted pleasure of listening to the groans of animals dying from poisoning seriously be considered protecting society? Can a practice where a living creature is subjected to the systematic infliction of pain really be called public defense? There's one more detail here that's especially important. Her persistent fascination with the various drugs used to actually carry out these animal killings. I actually did a deep dive into this exact topic in one of my previous videos, where I showed a clip of Kriminovska herself listing off the substances they used. We're talking specifically about drugs that, according to her own words, were supposedly used to treat dogs. And if we don't look at this in isolation, but rather in the context of the anti-cult network, which, according to all available facts, she represents, the picture becomes even more telling. Because we are not just looking at someone who practices animal cruelty. We are looking at a representative of a structure that originated in Russia and is coordinated by Alexander Dvorkin, a man who, according to the analyzed material, also exhibits a very specific fascination with violence, control, vulnerable victims, and the tools used to inflict harm. That is exactly why, in my opinion, this similarity doesn't look like a coincidence at all. It manifests, according to the materials we've analyzed, in the choice of the target, in the nature of the suffering inflicted, in the specific interest in substances as tools for killing, and in the subsequent attempts to cover it all up with the rhetoric of public good. In other words, what fundamentally changes is the justification. Within this interpretation, the internal logic remains largely the same. First comes the infliction of pain, followed by an ideological cover-up, and finally, the transfer of this behavioral model onto the people who, in the analyzed material, are designated as targets of the anti-cult activities. Today, Kriminovska is presenting herself in a completely different role as a cult expert and a defender of society against the threat allegedly posed by dangerous, destructive sex. Yet, judging by the materials we've analyzed, she is actually one of the key stakeholders in the campaign aimed at discrediting and criminally prosecuting Alatra volunteers in Ukraine. I need to emphasize here that Alatra is an international civil platform headquartered in Atlanta, USA. It brings together scientists, experts, and professionals from various fields across more than 180 countries. These people work together on a volunteer basis with a goal to comprehensively study climate, geodynamic, and environmental risks, to raise scientific awareness about these threats, to foster multilateral cooperation in finding sustainable solutions to global existential challenges, and to carry out activities aimed at protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Here are just a few examples of Alatra's activities on the international stage. Participating in the UN Climate Change Conference, COP29 in Baku, the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP16 in Colombia, the 16th session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification in Saudi Arabia, and COP30 in Brazil. The conference, United in Freedom, the Rise of Spiritual Diplomats, led by Pastor Mark Burns, at the Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C., USA, hosted on the Alatra platform. The conference, Freedom Has a Name, and it's called Ukraine, organized by Pastor Mark Burns within the framework of the Spiritual Diplomats Global Initiative on the Alatra platform in Washington, D.C., USA. The conference at the European Parliament titled Nanoplastics, Hidden Connections and Emerging Risks, organized by member of the European Parliament, Andrzej Knotek, together with the Alatra Global Research Center. The launch of a joint cooperation program between the Bolivian Vice Ministry of Civil Defense and the Alatra Global Research Center, aimed at improving the quality of governmental decision-making and developing a comprehensive risk management system in the face of climate and geodynamic changes. Raising the issue of the dangers of anti-cult stigmatizing rhetoric at international forums, including the OSCE Human Dimension Implementation meetings, to draw the attention of the human rights community and relevant experts to this problem as an issue directly tied to international human rights protection standards. The apostolic blessing granted by Pope Francis during his pontificate to Alatra and its president, Marina Ovtsinova, in support of the movement's work in environmental protection and the care of creation. Likewise, the current Pope Leo XIV granted his apostolic blessing on June 17, 2025, providing further inspiration to ALLATRA's president and all its volunteers for their dedicated work in fulfilling the movement's mission. Since 2015, ALLATRA has been deliberately targeted by an organized defamation and stigmatization campaign driven by Russian anti-cult structures coordinated by Alexander Dvorkin, such as Razziers, as well as the organizations affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. Because of this, the volunteers decided to investigate this destructive influence using their own situation as a case study, documenting its methods and its impact on society, fundamental rights, and democracy as a whole. We are talking about analytical and research work aimed at protecting not only the rights of ALLATRA volunteers, but the rights of every single person in society. Despite ALLATRA's open, public, and internationally recognized activities, it's been documented that on her portal, which she pitches as a journalistic platform, Irina Kriminovska doesn't just parrot false anti-cult narratives of Russian origin targeting ALLATRA. She actually openly describes her own role in initiating the persecution of law-abiding citizens who have become the target of a media smear campaign by the anti-cult network, a network coordinated by the Moscow Center under Alexander Dvorkin. In other words, she isn't just a bystander. She is an active carrier of the Russian anti-cult agenda within the Ukrainian media and legal space. Together with her ideological accomplice, Alexei Svitogor, who, according to Aspie News, is linked to the killing of over 3,000 dogs, and who has faced public testimonies regarding child abuse in an orphanage. Kriminovska has essentially become an instrument of legal pressure for the anti-cult network in Ukraine. It's exactly through this partnership that baseless expert evaluations are churned out, accusatory frameworks are fabricated, and processes are set in motion whose consequences go far beyond defamatory media campaigns, actively destroying the lives of law-abiding citizens. At the time this material was being put together, open sources show that both Kriminovska and Svitogor are themselves facing criminal charges in Ukraine, specifically accusations related to inciting hatred and collaborating with the enemy. And this just confirms our overarching conclusion. What we're looking at isn't just some spontaneous local activism. It is a Ukrainian executive node of the exact same anti-cult machinery that was developed, ideologically shaped, and launched from the Russian center tied to Dvorkin, the ALLATRA case as a demonstration model. Based on an analysis of the available materials, the persecution of ALLATRA is probably one of the most comprehensive illustrations of how the operational model attributed to the anti-cult network unfolds step by step. 1. 2015-2016. The initial stigmatization of the organization takes place in the Russian information space, using dehumanizing labels like sect and destructive cult, initiated by representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church affiliated with Razziers. 2. Expansion of the campaign in Ukraine. The anti-cult narrative morphs into branding them as a pro-Russian sect and Putin's sect. 3. August 8th, 2023. The organization is designated undesirable in Russia. Police raids begin. Cases of violence against former volunteers by FSB officers are documented, and both criminal and administrative cases are opened, riddled with severe and objective procedural violations by the relevant authorities. 4. November 2nd, 2023. Ukrainian law enforcement agencies take action against ALLATRA representatives. In the analyzed materials, these actions are linked to false and fabricated expert evaluations drawn up by the Razziers proxy node in Ukraine. 5. 2024. A massive anti-cult media campaign is launched in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. According to the analysis, around 400 articles are published in just 3 weeks. 6. June 24th, 2025, ALLATRA is designated as an extremist organization in Russia. I need to highlight a highly significant analytical anomaly in this case. In Ukraine and on Western anti-cult platforms, ALLATRA was portrayed as a pro-Russian sect, whereas in Russia, it was labeled pro-Ukrainian and extremist. These mutually exclusive labels clearly show that the stigmatizing framework is simply tailored to fit the local political context, rather than being based on any objective characteristics of the target group. And that is exactly why the ALLATRA case matters so much in this analysis, not just as an isolated episode, but as a demonstration model. It shows exactly how the anti-cult network, coordinated from its Russian center, systematically translates stigmatization into pseudo-expert evaluations, turns these pseudo-expert evaluations into aggressive law enforcement actions, and escalates a local campaign into a transnational system of persecution. It is important to understand this. The ALLATRA case is just one example, albeit the highly revealing one, that makes the structure and methodology of this transnational anti-cult network especially clear. Human rights and research discourse has documented far more cases where religious groups, civil initiatives, political figures, and private individuals have been targeted by this kind of activity. Just listing all these cases would take an enormous amount of time. But right now, it's crucial for me to not get bogged down in an endless litany of examples, but rather to continue breaking down the actual structure of this multi-level transnational network. In this context, the Czech Republic is of particular interest in this regard. It's exactly here that we can clearly see how, according to the materials we've analyzed, the anti-cult network's model can manifest within a democratic European environment, and how it can poison its functioning from the inside out, through the media, expert institutions, and reputational mechanisms. First and foremost, in the Czech information space, we see media amplification at work. We are talking about journalists and information projects that are used to systematically broadcast dehumanizing and stigmatizing narratives into the public sphere, targeting specific social groups, civil initiatives, and individuals, including politicians. It's exactly through platforms like these that the core labels of the anti-cult network, cult, sect, or sectarian, are injected and firmly implanted into the public consciousness. In other words, the media in this context aren't serving a neutral, descriptive function. They are acting as a mechanism for spreading and normalizing definitions that are manufactured within the ideological core of this network. The next level is expert legitimization. This is where the religious scholars and the other public figures posing as experts play a crucial role. According to documented facts, these are people who underwent training at the Dialogue Center alongside Alexander Dvorkin as far back as 1993. Based on our analysis, this center can essentially be viewed as a successor to an older lineage of European anti-cultism, one that traces its roots back to the apologetic structures that once collaborated with the Nazi regime. It's precisely through these expert figures that the anti-cult agenda secures its academic cover, allowing it to sound not like an ideological attack, but like a supposedly neutral, professional conclusion. And that right there is their core function. Not to build the narrative from scratch, but to legitimize its using the authority of an academic chair, a scientific title, and expert jargon. And within this environment, Jakub Jal stands out as one of the most radical actors. There are documented allegations against Jal, captured on film in documentaries, regarding the abuse of minors in Tanzania, including testimonies from over 30 individuals. I've covered this in detail in previous episodes, showing clips from a documentary where victims came forward to share their testimonies regarding Jakub Jal. Yet today, this individual is studying pedagogy at Charles University. He goes on television as an expert and drafts amateur religious evaluations which, by his own admission, are then used as evidence in actual court proceedings. Italy, Here, the key figure is Luigi Corvaglia, a board member and member of the scientific committee of FECRIS. Based on an analysis of publicly available facts, we can conclude that Luigi Corvaglia acts as an interface between the anti-cult network and the European media and grant ecosystem. He appears as a cult expert in publications by platforms like Facta, V-Square, Context, and Bird, organizations operating within European fact-checking and grant-making structures. Through these platforms, anti-cult narratives are injected right into the mainstream European media circuit under the guise of verified information and fighting disinformation. Now, take a look at this map. Different countries, different jurisdictions, different languages, but one terminology, one methodology, one operational logic, and one command center. In this video, I've only listed a fraction of the individuals who, according to the materials we've analyzed, are involved in an anti-cult infrastructure that reaches far beyond the borders of any single country. There are significantly more of these people out there. So, if we're looking for the right analogy, what we're really looking at is an iceberg. Only a small fraction is visible on the surface, while the massive bulk of connections, influences, and coordination mechanisms remain hidden from view. At the same time, let me reiterate, Alexander Dvorkin publicly claims that no anti-cult organization even exists, and many of the actors we've mentioned also refuse to admit their involvement in any unified ideological framework. But from the analytical and legal standpoint, the existence of a network doesn't depend on whether its participants actually admit to it. We can already see several major indicators: a unified classification system replicated across various countries, similar models of stigmatization and delegitimization, synchronized campaigns targeting the exact same groups, intersecting ties between ideologues, experts, journalists, and institutional proxies. It is precisely this combination of factors that allows us to raise the question, not of some random coincidence, but of a potentially structured mechanism with clearly defined roles and a specific, unified logic of action. Within this interpretation, this can be compared to an organized crime model where different participants carry out different functions. One manufactures the labels, another gives them a scientific veneer, a third injects them into court evaluations, and a fourth broadcasts them through the media. And by doing so, every single one of them becomes part of a process that can have severe, destructive consequences on the lives of targeted individuals. Let me emphasize this again. In the legal realm, the concept of a common plan or conspiracy does not require formal written agreement. Guilt is proven based on the totality of coordinated actions aimed at achieving a shared criminal goal. This doctrine establishes liability not just for directly committing a crime, but also for participating in its collective preparation and execution. As stated in Article 6 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, quote, leaders, organizers, instigators, and accomplices participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the foregoing crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any persons in execution of such plan, unquote. Moreover, the judicial logic here is crystal clear. To prove a conspiracy, it is not necessary for all participants to know each other personally, to meet in the same room, or to sign a single document. What's required is something else entirely: a shared goal, divided roles, and coordinated actions aimed at achieving that goal. From this perspective, what we have is not a chaotic jumble of isolated figures, but a reproducible system where every element amplifies the others. At their core, they are just mere reflections of one man, that exact same teenager who, according to the description in the books by James Ressler and Viktor Fridman, stood on the Moscow construction site, threw stones at a living child, and left. At this point, it is appropriate to cite a quote from the book, The Serial Killer Against God.
A man who now throws the stones of his expert opinions at living people, burying them alive in prisons. For him, there is no difference between that pit at the construction site and a courtroom in Russia or any other country.
The psychological profile of Alexander Dvorkin, pieced together from his autobiographical texts, the novel Kalalatsi, third-party testimonies, and video analysis, is interpreted in some of the analyzed materials as showing a specific set of traits. According to established criteria in behavioral analysis and clinical psychology, these traits are strongly associated with highly functional antisocial characteristics, featuring a very pronounced narcissistic and manipulative component. And let me reiterate, this is just a fraction of the information we have. It's crucial to understand that the activities of an anti-cult network, especially one coordinated by a person with this kind of psychological profile, don't just pose an isolated threat to individual religious minorities. They represent a systematic challenge to freedom of conscience and religion as a fundamental human right, democratic governments in the countries where this network operates, security, both on an individual level for the victim of stigmatization and on a public level in terms of the risks of escalation. The human rights community, state institutions, and international organizations need to stop looking at this setup as a fringe phenomenon or an interfaith dispute. They must recognize it for what it really is, a structural human rights problem that demands a coordinated, multi-jurisdictional, and interdisciplinary approach. And this brings us to the exact point where this investigation stops being just a conversation about an anti-cult network. So let's recap. We've mapped out the structure. We've traced the chronology. We've identified the nodes, the methodology, and the executioners. But in any investigation, once you've answered how and who, you're always left with one final, crucial question. Why? Why would a man with this kind of psychological profile spend decades systematically building a machine of pressure and persecution using institutions, state mechanisms, and international platforms to do it? And why are the targets of this exact pressure always attacked exactly where they are the most free, in their realm of faith, conscience, and inner choice, a space that by its very nature is not subject to any external control? There is a layer of information in the analyzed material that I deliberately haven't fully unpacked today, because it demands a separate, in-depth analysis of its own. This particular thread isn't about Alexander Dvorkin's external biography. It's about a potential internal conflict that is apparent in his writings, his quotes, autobiographical episodes, and those fragments that the author of the materials I've discussed today trace back to his early developmental years. I'm talking about a recurring psychological marker, about what classical FBI behavioral analysis, based on the work of John Douglas, calls a persistent signature aspect. And this aspect, drawing on the analysis by James Ressler and other authors, might point to a conflict that goes far beyond just individual religious or secular organizations, beyond just the social groups that the anti-cult network brands as dangerous sects, but rather a conflict with the very idea of God as a power greater than man, with the very idea that a human being has the freedom to choose whether to believe in something higher or not. I'll give you 3 facts. No interpretation, just the facts. Fact number 1, Alexander Dvorkin, a man who publicly presents himself as an Orthodox theologian and liturgical reader, compares the idea of God's presence in a person's soul to mold in his publications. I quote, "God is in the soul," as if, God is mold that appears in the soul by itself, unquote. Let me remind you of the Gospel of Luke, 17:21, quote, "The kingdom of God is within you," unquote. This is a central doctrine of the very church in whose name he speaks. Fact number 2. When asked, who is the best contemporary preacher? Dvorkin replies, among the living, I have no idea. He doesn't name Patriarch Kirill, whom he formerly serves, given the affiliation of his subordinate structures with the Russian Orthodox Church. Fact number 3. A quote from Alexander Dvorkin's autobiography, My America. I quote, "There is no God, and none of this will ever be. There will be no life, no joy. There will be nothing, nothing at all. There is only an absolute empty sky overhead." 3 facts, 3 markers, 3 points on the same straight line. In his book, The Serial Killer Against God, James Ressler puts forward a hypothesis that shifts everything we've analyzed today into a fundamentally different semantic and motivational plane. He writes that the subject's true motive isn't fighting specific organizations. It isn't religious polemics, and it isn't defending orthodoxy, which is how Alexander Dvorkin himself and his followers publicly spin it. In Ressler's interpretation, the issue is different. The systematic drive to prove that the sky is empty, that there is no higher protection, and that by persecuting, stigmatizing, and destroying the lives of believers, the subject is constantly trying to validate one single conclusion. God won't protect them because God doesn't exist. Every shattered life, every fabricated expert evaluation, every person driven to despair. This isn't just the byproduct of a man with a constant need to dominate by inflicting pain. This is his actual goal. In the next episode, we will conduct a full analysis of Alexander Dvorkin's psychological profile. We'll base this on his own writings, his speech patterns, his attitude toward death, toward power, toward the image of Christ, and toward the very concept of faith itself. I will show you exactly why the authors of the materials we've discussed today have concluded that behind the facade of a defender of the faith might actually hide a man waging war against faith itself, a war against human inner freedom, against that inner sanctuary inside each and every one of us that isn't subject to any evaluation, doesn't answer to any committee, and can never be brought under external control. And now, I'm going to ask what is perhaps the single most critical question of this entire investigation. What is more dangerous? A criminal who openly says, I don't believe in God and I can do whatever I want, or someone who speaks of God while wearing church vestments, standing behind an altar with the gospel in his hands, while systematically destroying innocent lives just to prove that God doesn't exist. Remember today's facts. Remember the sequence: label, expert evaluation, media, the state, repression, ruined lives. Remember the names. Remember the structure.